This is supposed to be the English-speaking program of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Turin, and this will be the course on ontology. It's a lack that is not a course on English language, for instance. So I'm not supposed to be your professor in English because my English, as you can understand, is very bad. But I'm supposed to be your ontology professor. And the title of our course this year, the discipline is ontology, and the title is emergence. So what is emergence? Of course, in Italian there is also the difficulty on the fact that emergenza means two different things. The emergency exit and, for instance, a philosophical theory of emergentism. This is not the case in English because we have two different words, emergence, which is the philosophical issue, and emergency, which is the emergency exit. So what is emerging? In order to show what is emerging, maybe it's useful to make a comparison between two ways of doing things, namely construction and emergence. First way, construction. This is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. It has been constructed, and we also are aware of how it was constructed. There was an architect, Gaudí, who made the idea in his head, then drew plans of the building, then made calculus and so on, and at the very end, this was the result of what they've done. No wonder that there is this result, because the beginning of the whole process was in some representation in the head of Gaudí. In a sense, this is the way by which knowledge and sometimes also construction of reality is represented by philosophers like Descartes or Kant. We have some principle in our head, then we have some schemes in order to apply this principle, and at the very end we have the result. It's very easy, this way of explaining how things happen, but there is something more difficult in another example, for instance. This is a nest of termites. It's surprisingly similar to Sagrada Familia, but the question is, how did the termites were able to conceive this kind of result? Of course, the termites are not at the very beginning the representation of Sagrada Familia. They have no special technical skills, albeit they have some technical skills, but sure, they had no previous thought about the result of this building. Of course, in order to build a church, the safest way is the Gaudí way. But the problem is that the most of what happens in the world happens this way and not this way. Namely, the most of the relevant things in the world, namely life or energy or even society, because also society is constructed more this way than this way, happens by emergence. And this is why it's important to understand emergence. the philosophers of the mechanical age, like Descartes of Kant, had a pretty easy way to explain knowledge and reality with this mechanical example of construction. But we are no more at the epoch of Descartes and Kant, and we have to explain this. This is the real difficult explanandum, and it's an explanandum that makes which is philosophically interesting and existing since, of course, many years, because people always were surprised of how, for instance, animal can build something technical without having plans. What is the kind of faculty was used by, say, animals to build what they build. And moreover, and coming to us, how it happens that in our experience we can have a process which begin with very rose feelings, for instance, hot, humidity, color, and then we can have sophisticated thought. There is two ways of explaining sophisticated thoughts in our mind. The one is to explain it, so to speak, in a Pentecostal way. I say Pentecostal way because it supposes, exactly like in the Pentecost, that a spirit comes down from the heaven into the home of the apostles and makes a very successful linguistic training to the apostles. The Pentecostal way, which is more diffused than we imagine. We imagine that there is a spiritually independent origin of our thought, and is, for instance, the example of the theory of expression, as we find it in Aristotle, that say that we have the ideas in the mind. Then we have the symbols of the ideas in the speech, and the symbol of the speech in the writing. This is what Aristotle says at the very beginning of Perihermeneias, the interpretazione. Of interpretation. The Pentecostal way is a constructive way. But we have also an emergentist way. That works this way. From writing to speech to ideas. How is possible this? It's surprising. Is it possible to write before speaking and especially before having ideas? This is simply stupid, or at least stupid do this, writing without ideas. But clever people does not make this way. I want to demonstrate, and this could be, in a sense, the only and unique sense of this course, that is not so surprising this emergent this way, from writing to speech to ideas. And we can also find a good example of this, say, strange inversion of reasoning in a passage of Aristotle, which comes not from the Interpretazione, but from a book who is very close to the Interpretazione, at least in the systematization of Aristotle's work, namely posterior analytics. Here we have this passage that explains us how experience comes out from life and how the thought, the skill, and the science can grow up from experience. So, in a sense, from writing, the pure material part, to speech, to ideas, to the meaning. Aristotle, as is often used to do, take an example from the life of animals, and says, animals in which it, namely the impression of perceiving, does come into being, have perception, and can continue to retain the sense impression in the soul. This means there are some animals who has no memory. They are not able to maintain the trace of the perception. In a sense, they have no writing. They are not able to be impressed by the impression. In a sense, this kind of animals are a really stupid animal. A really stupid animal is an animal without writing because he has no memory. He cannot progress because simply he sees this wall, and then he sees this wall, and he can stay all the time looking at this wall like a continuous new spectacle, because he's not able to say, look, it's the same wall as before, this is another wall, here we have two walls. But there are some animals, among those animals are included professors and students, that can continue to retain sense impression in the soul. And when such persistence is frequently repeated, a further distinction at once arises between those which, out of the persistence of such sense impression, develop a power of systematizing them, and those which do not. Much more complicated, but at the very end is the difference between two kinds of storage of the impression. We have, there can be a larger or a smaller memory. If you have a larger memory, you have more skill in order to make complex ideas. Why? One can say that, in fact, there is only a quantitative difference between a small memory and a larger memory. But since the impressions stored are several, if you have multiple different impressions, then you can obtain a larger knowledge, since knowledge is making differences. The Greek term logon, and logos, which is at the root of logic, for instance, means simply that you are able of making comparison and difference. For instance, take these two segments. This segment is the double of this other segment. The logos of the relation between these two segments is 2. This is simply to have logos. Here, as we see why it's so important to have a large archive of records, because the large archive of records allows you to make more effective difference, so to become closer to logos. Note, this point is the first source of emergence, which was captured by the sentence of Hegel, who says that, Hegel, you know, the old guy, German guy, who says that dialectics shows how the quantitative can change in qualitative. There are moments in which a quantitative increase is transformed into a qualitative increase. Can you tell us an example of this? Look, for instance, one of the most serious problems for artificial intelligence when she was conceived about 40 years ago was to build machine for translation. They wanted to make machine for translation from a language to another. And they did not succeed because it was too complicated. Now we have a very good, efficient way of translating with Google Translate. Why? Because since Google Translate has a gigantic archive of language text translation, then it becomes easier to make these logos and to translate from a language to another. Simple example of how the quantity is changed into quality. So, out of sense perception comes to be what we call memory, and out of frequently repeated memories of the same thing develops experience. For a number of memories constitutes a single experience. From experience again originate the skill of the craftsman and the knowledge of the man of science, skill in the sphere of coming to be and science in the sphere of being. If you have this larger memory, then you can make differences and unities. For instance, the unity that comes from the iteration of frequently repeated experiences. And from this experience that you stored in your mind, then you became able to construct something. It says the skill of the craftsman, something which has to do to transform, and the knowledge of the man of science, the fact that you know the real being of things. This is a typical emergentist approach, was strongly criticized and indecised for good reasons by Kant, who said that Aristotle was doing his categories in a rhapsodic way, picking up his category from experience. The idea of Kant was that we have to pick the categories in the pure reason and then apply those categories to experience. But this kind of description is very clear, the description of something that grew up from experience. There is seemingly not a real change from the lowest level, the level of the inscription of the perception, and the highest level, the level of the skill of the craftsman and the knowledge of the man of science. There is a continuity between the Termits and Gaudí. It's a long history, but this way we can explain how happened with the Church of the Termits. This description of experience can be schematized this way, the description in posterior analytics. There is a first step from sensation to persistence. There is something very important that happens in the moment in which a perception persists, because the perception is singular, happens in this moment, and for this perception I am passive. For instance, suppose that my right hand is an independent being vis-à-vis my left hand. Then my left hand receives this impression. I am passive, and the impression happens at this time, and that's all. Then here remains a trace. This trace makes no difference. There is not a change from the perception, except that the perception is no more actual, is no more in presence, and remains this, which in a sense is already a kind of activity, because is in a sense there is the power of retaining this impression in my hand and also in my head, supposing that I have a head, and then I can say dream about this impression, a bad dream, but a dream nonetheless, think about this impression, make some imagination play about this impression, and all this kind of performance are allowed simply by the presence of something that at the very origin was passive. Imagine the amazing power of imagination. In what consists? Well, you have you see a bird and a horse, and then you can imagine a horse with the wings. Where does comes a horse with the wings? Simply comes from the association of two different memories. So persistence, which is very basical, in fact entails something immense, of immense relevance for knowledge. Then there is the passage from the persistence to the archive. The archive means many things. Means, for instance, the possibility of an evolved brain like our brain of having plenty of memories. How the thoughts depends from memory is indirectly proved by the destruction of thought that comes together with the destruction of memory. If Alzheimer ill is, for us, a nightmare, is because we are perfectly aware that losing the memory, which seems to be a pure material part of the brain, is losing the thought, the spiritual part of the brain. So there is no exteriority between the spiritual part of the brain and the material part of the brain, which could be, in a sense, surprising, because for us, memory is something that could be also mechanical. For instance, we have no difficulty to say this smartphone has 56 megabyte of memory. No. But there is something common in this smartphone and in my head, and is this possibility of archive. Then, if we have the archive, then we are able to make a differentiation. Look, for instance, this kind of comparison. Of course, you can make much more differentiation, and this can create a very sophisticated scale of thought, of relations, and but for doing this is needed the archive. This is why PC is much more effective depending on its memory, and especially on its working memory. What is the working memory of a PC? Is the part of the memory of PC that allows him to maintain active different parts of the entire memory in order to make comparison. And the same happens in experience. You can do differentiation if and the more you can do differentiation, the more you have logos. Consider, for instance, the fact that the simple functioning of a language depends on memory and on differentiation. There is not an intrinsic reason for the fact that there is, say, dog. Is there anything intrinsic in dog? Of course not, because you can say Hund or chien, perro. I don't say cane because this is an English speaking course. And of course, why this different form of speaking achieve their goal? Because each one of them is related in differential terms with other terms of the same language. So suppose there is something similar between chien and chou, cabbage, but the difference consists in the fact that there is a U instead of a N, a O instead of a E, and there is no a I. And in general, all the language consists in difference. All the code consists in difference. What is the meaning of a code? A code is a regulated series of difference. And in order to have a code, there is something much profound than the code, which is the archive. So never underestimate the memory, because from memory comes all. And then from the differentiation grew up the thought, the fact of being able of action and of thought. This is a kind of a scheme that we can obtain from the quote of Aristotle. And we see that in the first step we need recording in order to go from the sensation to the persistence. In the second step, what do we need? Recording again, because an archive is an increased quantity of recording. And in order to obtain differentiation, note differentiation, not repetition, what we need again? Recording. And from differentiation to thought, recording is very simple, but but at the very end, the attempt of this course will be to show how, on very simple basis, we can obtain very complex performance, and this explains the way of working of living being, and the way of evolution of living being, the way of evolution of technology. Don't underestimate. Also because this description could be considered the opposite or the specular representation to the description of the construction in Kant's perspective. Because in Kant, the idea is that we start from the cogito, the thought make differentiation, and this is the step of the judgment, the beginning of the analytics of critique of pure reason. In order to have clear ideas, we have to start from pure judgment. Then, from the judgment, we have the categories, namely the fact that in the archive we can make a differentiation. Then we have the schemes, which are the application of the categories to the experience, and the schemes are defined by Kant as a result of imagination and as forms of time, which means exactly something that has to do with the relation between archive and persistence. And then the way in which, by which all categories act over the single experience are the principle, and this is the result. It's interesting that one can, in a way slightly negative to Kant, to say that Aristotle tells us in, say, 15 lines what Kant tells us in 700 pages, but this is not the case. Kant tells us much more than this, but the very basis of what he says is this. And in order to translate this into our description of emergence, we have the first step, which is the trace, the second step, which is the inscription, the third step is the iteration, and the fourth step is the alteration. Namely, we have first a trace that leaving a trace on a blackboard. Then there is the permanence, the inscription. The permanence allows something which is extremely relevant, which is the iteration. The iteration is the origin of several different things, of technical devices which act by iteration. For instance, the camera working now are acting by memory and iteration. If you don't have iteration, you don't have cameras. And also the ideas works on the basis of iteration, because the idea is the persistence of a meaning, and the persistence of a meaning is allowed by a power of indefinite iteration of this meaning. This is a classic example done by Edmund Husserl. On a text on the origins of geometry. What is the origin of geometry? The geometry is an ideal science, so that we can imagine that the geometry is independent from the empiricity. But if the first geometer was not able to fix the first theorem in his head, then the theory will disappear. Imagine that Thales was Alzheimer's Hill, no geometry for the rest. Then it was necessary that the discovery was communicated to others in order to make it science, and then it was necessary that the discovery was written on a support, because the very possibility of writing and of transmitting in a temporal dimension a single invention is the possibility of progress. We cannot have progress without this kind of fixing the idea. And this is and this iteration creates the alteration, namely something which is qualitative different, even if it's only on a basis of a quantitative implementation.